Tuesday evening. It's 8 p.m. in Central Europe, and it's Wednesday early morning in New Zealand. And we are delighted to welcome you to another episode of our Space Café 33 Minutes with Héloïse Vertadier and Christopher Johnson about the Lunar Policy Handbook, guiding responsible and sustainable development of the Moon. As always, we truly value your participation and ongoing feedback, and we are committed to learning from your input and continuously improving our webinars to make them more engaging and informative with you. I'm Torsten, I'm the publisher of SpaceWatch.Global, and we are a Europe-based online platform for information in and about space and new space activities in a geopolitical context. I would like to thank all of our private and corporate supporters in 2023 that showed their continuous commitment to keep our independent journalism alive. We really appreciate that. And I know many of you are already familiar with our website, our bi-weekly and daily newsletters, and the Space Café podcast. The latest one will be published tomorrow. Due to the Easter break, all the things went crazy. And tomorrow's episode features Markus Moslechner's conversation with the venture capitalist Thierry Vapola. And we are working on new exciting episodes of the Space Café radio, so stay tuned for more. Our fan shop is open always for you because it's on our website, and it's a great way for you to support us actively and become a space watcher. And if you have missed any of our previous web talks, we have an archive available on our webpage in the events section, and you can also find us on YouTube. The story of my guest today is easy to tell. 2.5 weeks ago, I attended the legal subcommittee session at UNCOPIUS in Vienna. A few days later, the Lunar Policy Handbook was released, and I know I want to learn more. So simply, I asked the two main authors, and please correct me if I'm wrong here, and invited them to our Space Café today. So a very warm welcome, Héloïse Vertadier, and very warm welcome to my good friend Chris Johnson to our Space Café here. So let me take off this slide, and we should be all now on one screen. So Héloïse is the co-founder and manager of the Breaking Ground Trust, and in addition to her experience in her expertise in cyber and aviation law, she completed the MSS program at the ISU and is finishing her Ph.D. at Otago University in New Zealand. And saying that, the three of us are ISU alumni. So I didn't want to call up the mafia thing again, but it's ISU. So her thesis on global governance, space law, and establishing human settlements on the moon is supported by a grant from the Luxembourg Space Agency. Héloïse's work explores the intersection of law and technology, developing innovative policies using existing legal tools. She has previously worked with the Open Lunar Foundation and NASA Ames Research Center, and her contributions to the field have been recognized through numerous publications. And Chris, not so much to say about you because everyone knows you here in the house. He is a graduate of the International Institute of Air and Space Law at Leiden University and interned at the UN Office of Outer Space Affairs. For the past 8 years, he served as the space law advisor at the Secure World Foundation, a non-governmental organization focused on creating cooperative solutions for advancing space sustainability. Welcome again to our Space Café, Héloïse and Christopher. By the way, is my pronunciation of Héloïse correct, or?
Yeah, it's correct. Thank you.
It's okay-ish. I mean, it's
No,
as good
it's
as a
good.
German can be. Let's put it that way.
It's good. It's better than most of people, you know. That's all good.
Better than most of the people, but Okay, we leave it at that. Chris, let's start with a why question. With the establishment of the Park Government Working Group on Space Resources for all Moonkind and the Working Group on Resources at UNOSA, among other global initiatives, what led to the development of this Lunar Policy Handbook?
Well, thank you for inviting me and allow me to take the floor, the first pass at your question. You know, as I think about it, if we were to take a deeper perspective on this in a multi-decade perspective, at some point, I don't know the details, the precise details, but America and NASA had plans to return to an asteroid, the ARM mission, the ARM mission, and then they changed gears. Why did they change gears and go and say we want to go back to the moon? One was because they looked at Mars, they looked at the moon, they looked at asteroids, and they said that maybe the first stepping stone towards Mars is a planetary body. Let's return to the moon. And so it was kind of a programmatic shift to return to the moon in the US that matched, I would say, ambitions elsewhere in the world, at least from ESA. ESA DG Jan Warner had the idea of a moon village. And there has always been strong interest in lunar exploration from other countries. I'm thinking JAXA. So really, it was fortuitous that American space exploration ambitions aligned with space exploration ambitions elsewhere around the world. And so they said, like, we will have a return to the moon. We'll do it through this Artemis program. So there's, a greater governmental interest, but there's also a greater commercial interest. And if we look at planned lunar activities in the next few years, we see a very impressive and diverse list of countries and companies that want to return to the moon. That was what we saw from the law and policy community. And as I looked at, and as many of the other co-authors looked at, the state of space law as it exists, when we look at the Outer Space Treaty and the subsequent UN treaties on space, and then we looked at national plans and national policies for lunar activities, there was a mismatch, I would say. There was not enough law that would, sufficiently guide activities that we want to do on the moon. So when you have, greater ambitions for what you want to do on the moon, and kind of a law was lacking, and then you kind of realized, like, oh, we should think through some of these things. If we're going to permit commercial activities on the moon, if we're going to be doing more diverse, more sustained, long-term things on the moon, long-term activities on the moon, let's not do this in an ad hoc fashion. Let's not do this as whatever's anyone's idea of what they want to do on the moon. Let's just permit it because it sounds like a good idea. In fact, let's be thoughtful about this. Mm-hmm. So this really was just a fortuitous confluence of interest that was from my side, from Secure World Foundation and looking at commercial activities in space and governance, along with a couple other organizations that we got to know at COPWAS over the last few years. And I'll mention For All Moonkind, but it's also Arizona State University's Interplanetary Initiative and the MIT Media Lab and Space Generation Advisory Council. And our great partner in this was really Open Lunar Foundation, which Héloïse is from, but also I want to make sure that people recognize and acknowledge that it was Jesse Kate Shingler and Chelsea Robinson and the other folks that we've known at Open Lunar who were excellent partners in convening these moon dialogues. And our 5 organizations have met since really starting in 2020. And it was only last year where we realized we need to come up with some type of lunar policy handbook that looks at the state of law as it is now, regulating lunar activities, and then looks at all the things that we're going to do on the moon in the next few years and says, what are the precedent-setting aspects of some of these activities? And let's be thoughtful about this and see what we can say and make sure that decision makers and policymakers and regulators know that to not just permit activities, but to be thoughtful about the precedent-setting nature of what they're going to permit. That was my take on it. Héloïse, you were the main actor behind this in many respects. Do you think I've captured that?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great summary. And I think for those who don't know, those 6 organizations form the Moon Dialogues, which is a partnership that focuses on governance and coordination aspects of lunar activities. So the handbook focusing on those activities and those questions is really a representation of the mission of the Moon Dialogues and the tangible aspects of that group of conveners and people, and also other people that joined us for the Lunar Policy Handbook, but I will mention that later. I think the main focus, as you said, Chris, is really that we recognize that there was a lack of global, or a lack of place or handbook or source of knowledge that would summarize all those questions and also put them into practice with different sort of activities. Because when we talk about governance on the moon, we usually see it as one single mass, but it's much more complicated than that. There's different types of activities, and I'll go into more details on that later. But that's really what the handbook wanted to capture.
You can't kidnap my first question and then provide the next 33 minutes of monologue here. So I know that is a challenge when working with lawyers. But Chris, I expected another answer because Secure World Foundation wrote this wonderful handbook for new actors in space, or on the small side years ago in various editions. You said, and I thought the idea is just, let's do a lunar handbook. So easy answer. So, but just my interpretation. Héloïse, can you provide us some more insight into the teams? We heard who were the teams, but I think the people that contributed to this book were just even more than from the convening companies or organizations behind. And particular, the interest. What are the interests they represent? So what is the output, or is it desired?
Yeah, of course. So to create that kind of handbook, it takes a village, as I'm sure we're all very aware. So it goes from, writing. So we needed authors, we needed an editor, or multiple editors in that case. We also needed someone to design the handbook, and then, promoting it and doing all the launch event communication, etc. So it's really a massive teamwork effort, sorry. And so Chris mentioned the 6 main organizations that are part of the Moon Dialogue. So obviously they are at the center of the Lunar Policy Handbook. So I won't repeat them, but Chris just said them. But so we had team members from those convening organizations joining and helping with the Lunar Policy Handbook in a few capacities, including authors, promotion, and strategy. And on top of that, we also had individuals that were recommended by the people of the convening teams to join us as mainly authors. And eventually, Chris with Secure World Foundation recommended the designer that we ended up working with. So it's really a big group of people. We're talking about 19 individuals coming from 6 different organizations mainly, but also I think there's 4 different organizations on top of that. From those individuals that joined us a bit later. So it's a big group of people that represent a lot of aspects of those questions about lunar activities. Like I mentioned, we wanted really to focus on different types of lunar activities. So going from orbital activities, landed activities, resource utilization, etc. So it requires a broad range of expertise to answer those questions. So when you talk about the interests that represent, for instance, some people and that joined us from the team of the Lunar Policy Handbook are from an engineering background, others are from a policy experts background. We have obviously lawyers, we're great representations of those, but we also have international relations experts, tax lawyers, etc. Because like I said, it really requires a village to have a small understanding of how big those questions are and how complex they are and how intricate they are with each other as well.
Any particular shootout to people you want to do? I mean, we have Harshita in the house. We have
yeah.
many
Harshita
others.
did an exceptional job editing the handbook, so massive shout out to her. I also wanted to give a big acknowledgement to the designer, Chris Duchesne, who did a fantastic job despite the very tight deadlines that we gave him. And I'm sure I'm forgetting a lot of people, but honestly, shout out to the whole team, because everyone took the time, especially on their personal time, because this whole team is volunteers, to write that handbook, show up to the meetings, help in any aspect that they could, and always be so proactive and so thoughtful in the way they approached that handbook. And without them, it wouldn't have been possible to make it. So massive thank you to the whole team.
Wonderful. And we just got a question here. Please share the handbook document. Yes, it's available on the, I think, Open Lunar or Moon Dialogue webpage, but we also will put it in the link in our thank you email then later, or today, or latest then tomorrow. And as you mentioned, what impressed me at the first glance was this amount of contributors, well-known experts in their field, and it's the who's who of actors in the moon conversations. I don't want to call it Moon Dialogue because that's your brand on that. So, Chris, are you with us?
Sorry about that. Yeah, stable internet.
And you said you're calling in from DC? No, I don't want to go into the details here. Okay. Upon reviewing the first half of the book, there seems to be a strong emphasis on the Artemis Accords. I didn't want to call it a promotion of the Artemis Accords, but it felt like that. So particularly in relation to site selection, safety zones, resource management. Would you comment on that observation, or is it just Thorsten that is totally wrong with his observation?
No, I mean, I think you're a bit right in that observation. I don't know if I would have arrived at it, but it is, you know, if you sit down and read the Artemis Accords, you go, it feels like I'm reading the Outer Space Treaty, at least for a lot of it. There's the Artemis Accords just takes one or two steps forwards in development of lunar norms beyond what is in the Outer Space Treaty. And that is in areas like interoperability, cultural heritage sites, and safety zones and resource use. So in that sense, and how many times does the Artemis Accords make explicit reference to the Outer Space Treaty? Almost a bit too much. Like they're mentioned over and over and over again that we're stepping through what is already done there on the Outer Space Treaty, and that's because if you were to just take a general look at the nature of space law, what norms do we actually have governing humankind's activities on the moon? Like we have international responsibility and liability, protection of astronauts, non-weaponization of the moon, or exclusively peaceful purposes in Article 4, Paragraph 2 of the Outer Space Treaty, and then some vague yet binding norms and obligations found in Article 9 about due regard, that states shall pay due regard to the corresponding interests of all other states and shall adopt measures to avoid harmful contamination. Not contamination, but harmful contamination. And then there's visitation rights, which exist on a basis of reciprocity in Article 11. So that's really not a whole lot in terms of when you start thinking about the lunar environment, a place which is 238,000 miles from Earth. I don't know how many kilometers that is for the rest of the world, and is subject to, cosmic background radiation, solar and space weather, solar flares, where there is no atmosphere, where there's 1/6 gravity, and where we want to do a host of activities from looking at finding resources that are usable there to economic development and inhabitation of the moon, and where there's everything from lava tubes to permanently shadowed regions and cold traps, radio quiet zones, peaks of eternal light, rare earth elements and other resources that we want to utilize, and a variety of reasons to go there: national prestige, commerce, scientific investigations. All of that is governed by the modest obligations in the various articles of the Outer Space Treaty. It's not a whole lot. So we had to start thinking of, well, what does it say? Even if it's vague, it is still binding in Article 9, et cetera. And, Artemis Accords is one effort by a set of nations to develop some type of lunar norms. I like what's in there, but it's honestly, even the Artemis Accords is not going to get it. It's not going to solve all those issues and clearly regulate what we want to do on the moon. When I start mentioning all those different activities that we'd like to do.
I like that you phrased it, a development of a number of nations. I like it. No comments on that. So, Héloïse, back to you. In the context of behaviors and debris and conflicts and heritage and peaceful purposes, how does this handbook now aim to promote innovation in governance, coordination, and policy activities to support the lunar economy system, what Chris just mentioned? So how do you dealt with this pretty complex setting, I would say?
It's obviously extremely complex, and the end goal is really to promote the sustainable exploration and use of lunar resources as well. So with that, you obviously have the economic side of things of the question, but you also have the scientific side of the question, the cultural side. So all of those are intricated to each and every single activity that will take place on the moon, and there's a lot of activities that will take place on the moon. So what the handbook tried to do as best as we could, because obviously no handbook could ever, summarize perfectly and in great precision the complexity of those questions. You would need thousands of pages for each and every single activity. So what we really tried to do is to provide recommendations to promote the responsible behavior on the lunar surface. So, for instance, the first part of the handbook really summarizes all the policy questions that exist, that we know of, that we're familiar with. And the second part of the handbook focuses on the types of activities and the policy implications that those activities have. So the policy implications that those activities have will be different from, infrastructure activities that I mentioned earlier. It would be different from the end of life policy implications that would be raised by those activities. So really, each chapter is created following an outline that is roughly the same for each of them, and it's to really focus on giving an in-depth analysis of the precedent settings that will occur because of the activities. And with that, referring to the part one, which explains the main policy issues and questions, just analyzing what is already covered, but what isn't. So those are the gray areas, and that's how you promote innovation, in my eyes at least, of governance, is to have a very clear picture and very clear understanding of the situation you're looking at and what already exists, what can you use and leverage to promote innovation and governance and sustainable use or sustainable, lunar future. And also, what are the limits of it, and where can we pitch in to promote a better, or at least a more precise framework for each activity. So that's really what the handbook tried to do. Chris, I'm sure you have another take on that.
It looked like that Chris have something to say, but
well, it was dawning on me that space law to date for the first half century of space law largely has governed vehicles in orbit, spacecraft in orbit, low Earth orbit, medium Earth orbit, and in geo. And now, as we go to another celestial body, we're going to a place that is not just a place we're transiting through and moving at orbital velocity. It's a destination. We're going to a new world. And here, space law is different and will continue to be different, where there'll be some, I predict, some type of differentiation in space law, where we will come up with actual moon law, moon-specific law, because we're at a place where we will be staying at for long periods of time, using resources, where humans will be persisting for long periods of time. And so many concepts from Earth about, I don't know, construction, corporate law, property rights, even human rights, criminal law, we will have to transpose them, to the extent that it makes sense, to a different destination where there, as I said before, radiation, no atmosphere, less gravity, no people, hardly any people there. That's the exciting thing when I think about the future of space law, is that it will have to become a whole lot more complex, and there's a whole lot more lunar norms and governance that we will have to develop. So I think now is an incredibly exciting time to be getting into space law. And I hope to see some moon lawyers that are specific to moon law in the future. Like Héloïse, if you're doing a PhD on that,
Just a comment or a remark to our audience today. The 33 minutes is more a metaphor today of the program. So don't count us on that. We will run over that, because we're now in the process of concluding the part one, the setting of what is there. And my question to Chris is here. The part one describes the governance, and there's a statement that existing provisions lack specifically for a wide variety of activities on the moon. Can you help us to understand that? It sounds like, yep, we have a rule set, but does it apply? Not really. So that's the translation in a non-lawyer world.
I mean, just think about it. If we have Article 9 that we have to pay due regard, and a prohibition on harmful contamination, or an encouragement to prevent harmful contamination, and we have treatment of astronauts as envoys of mankind, and visitation rights on a basis of reciprocity, and the non-appropriation principle of Article 2, which is matched with the freedom of exploration and use in Article 1. And in fact, the very title of the Outer Space Treaty says use of outer space, including the moon. How, when you have those vague yet binding obligations and freedoms, and now we want to, say, construct a landing pad or construct roadways between points of interest that are, and both landing pads and maybe roadways on the moon are going to be shared between nations or shared between actors. How we're actually going to set up rules for that and adhere to those rules, first agree on those rules, and then adhere to them and enforce them, subject to Article 4, the moon shall be used exclusively for peaceful purposes, and that military bases, installations, and fortifications are not allowed on the moon, and that military weapons testing and maneuvers are not allowed on the moon. That's just one scenario where you say we need to develop new rules as how we're going to use shared landing pads, use roadways, and that's just like a transit type of activity. Once we start looking at, say, commercial activity with using resources, accessing resources, harnessing resources, manufacturing with resources, and then selling them onto other actors, we don't have how that looks like. And there is national space legislation on space resource use. There's other innovations like the Breaking Ground Trust about how property rights will work in space. But I don't have any answers. I just have more and more questions as to how we can do these things in a sustainable fashion, in an economically viable fashion, and in a peaceful fashion. And we have the opportunity to create, I would say, new methods or new systems where it isn't just a rush for resources, it isn't just a colonial land grab, and it isn't just a extractive, extractive capitalism, where we say it's all resources and let's just use those resources as quickly and as profitably as possible. That's not how it's going to work in space, because we're in an area outside of state territory. It's going to work some other way, and it should work some other way.
But didn't the human history show that we're setting facts and then thinking about laws and regulations thereafter? Isn't that the same what we are seeing now in space as well? And yes, we have this framework, as you mentioned, the Outer Space Treaty, what is in its form nice, but it's very vague. So, and now we are seeing this race to the moon, or race to space, however we want to call it, by private and national actors to set facts.
Yeah.
So, and I know.
I mean, Héloïse helped me out here, but
we didn't promise answers here, but
it's like, all right, look at the ITU regime governs use of geo in a rational, equitable, efficient, and economical fashion. Those things don't sit easily with each other, but they have allowed early actors to share the resource with later actors, and to do so in a way that is more equitable than merely whoever gets there first gets to set the rules.
ITU is something what is very close to my heart, and it comes later when we come to the implementation, because if we see the commercial usage of frequencies on the moon is not clarified on the ITU, and it's maybe on the notes of the WRC 2027, what is in 4 years from now. By then, we have that established. We have commercial players on the moon communicating and sending signals back or doing whatever they do over there. So there's still, for me, the gap. But let's move on to the implementation part officially. So, and welcome now to part 2. And Louise, that's one for you. So we see the moon expected to experience increased activities from commercial and institutional missions over the next 3 years alone. How did you identify and assess the gaps and gray areas in terms of regulation and implementation? And I know we are going back and forth here and pointed to that, but maybe you can give us a bit more structured answer.
Yeah, of course. I just want to backtrack a second on your question before about when you said throughout human history, we've always acted after, especially for the laws and everything. And I just want to say it's not working well for us to do that, right? Climate change, climate crisis, rise of tensions, etc. So I think what we're really trying to push with this Lunar Policy Handbook is to try something else, to try to be proactive, even if the answers that are provided in this handbook are not the ones that are going to be used eventually in 20 years, let's say. At least it's a first step, and it creates debate and it creates a discussion. And I think that's what's fundamental today, to ensure that the lunar future does not copy what we're seeing happening on Earth, especially climate change. So now to answer your question about the gray areas. So I think the main point is that the gray areas were considered and identified by the different authors of part 2 of the Lunar Policy Handbook. So each author, was allocated a chapter on different types of activities. We have 8 different types of activities. I've mentioned a few already. And each author is an expert in that field, in that type of activities, whether they are from the policy side, from the more technical engineering side, etc. So they're very familiar with those questions. And so with that, they have conducted thorough, research on the policy implications of those types of activities. They have made an analysis of international laws, whether they are space laws or others, of national laws as well applicable, did the trade-off of the the challenges, the mitigations, and then identified where the law or the policy or the governance systems were lacking. And those focus on the gray areas, which are for each chapter identifies those gray areas. And after that, the authors provide recommendations after this whole thorough analysis of how to enter those gray areas and what can we do to ensure that they do not overtake or even jeopardize the activities in question.
Got it. Chris, anything to add from your end? Oh, good. So, Héloïse, then let's stay on one of the examples. One of my favorites are lunar orbital activities, and they are significant topic in the Lunar Policy Handbook. Can you provide an overview of your recommendations, or the recommendations, obviously, from the authors, for maintaining this pristine nature of the lunar environment that we have today?
Of course. So the author was Jessica Schindler, so I will try to, express what she wrote in that chapter. But obviously, if you want to have more details, I invite everyone to go and read that specific chapter. So I think the lunar orbits it's a very interesting topic, as you've mentioned. There's a lot of questions that come with it. They're going to be extremely useful for remote sensing, for communication purposes, monitoring, etc. So there will be a massive and a very central questions of lunar activities, and especially on the policy side. With that comes, the question of debris, of decommissions, of end of life. So there's a lot of interrogation points around orbital activities. And what Jessica wrote in that chapter as a recommendation, the main recommendation was to adopt norms of conduct that are coordinated and transparent, and also create a notification system. So really, it's the cooperation aspect of things that would be one of the main recommendations for that type of activities, to ensure that each actor is aware of the others, each actor is respectful of the others. We prevent harmful interference as well by having that sort of notification and coordination mechanism. And I think if you also think about it from a slightly different perspective, there's other recommendations that could be made, or at least other questions that need to be raised. I mentioned a few, but I think the end-of-life disposal would be the major one in my eyes, because on Earth, when a satellite is decommissioned, we just burn it in the atmosphere and it just disappears. On the Moon, we don't have that option. So decommission and end of life will be an incredibly important question, especially for the sake of the lunar surface, because we cannot just land it and crash it on the lunar surface, right? So that will be one of the most important questions. And I think there is a huge need for standards, or at least guidelines, on how to do this in a coordinated manner to avoid chaos, basically.
I would love to see an answer on the end-of-life management thing, because that is something I thought of many years ago. And Chris, to get you back here in the conversation, because you start reading our it's in the handbook. Yeah, it's okay. It's okay. Yeah.
Because I realized you were going to ask me questions about sections I didn't write. So.
Of course, that's a fun fact. Yeah. I mean, as someone who once dreamed of landing a rover on the moon and establish an LTE network, what are your thoughts on surface activities, and how does the Lunar Policy Handbook addresses this potential policy implication of specific lunar activities, such as orbital, landed, or infrastructural ones? And I mean,
yeah, so those are
on the roads already.
Yeah, I mean, so each of those activities, you can divide them up between orbital, landed, and mobility activities, or divide them up between the actors that are doing those activities, or whether those activities are commercial, largely commercial, or governmental, or scientific in nature, and not military in nature for the reasons I explained before. But again, the space law does not give priority to any commercial over scientific, or scientific over commercial, or national prestige over commercial or scientific. Essentially, all that we have is what I mentioned before, which was that due regard. And that regard, which is due, is some type of amount, some type of quantum. So due regard, therefore, allows for some type of disregard, meaning if I'm going to do an activity and you're also going to do that activity, I don't have to always defer to you. and you don't have to always defer to me. It's that somehow there should be some type of equitable arrangement and sharing, certainly on which is encouraged under various transparency and confidence building measures in the Outer Space Treaty, and which have built up over decades of space activities, to share information, to coordinate, and not cause harmful interference or disregard to the activities of others. And honestly, that is all that I can say with any amount of confidence in what the law requires. So I hope, and it is in any actor's long-term interest, to set the right precedent, to say, all right, I'm going to be doing this activity first, but other actors will follow after me. And therefore, I should be setting the correct norms that I would and model the correct norms that I would want other actors to display for that next hill when I'm second and they're first. And for when there's a variety of actors acting on the moon, let's not set off a land grab or a first come, first serve or race to the bottom. But let's model the behaviors that we would like others to display. That's all I could say that we have, is that some type of encouragement.
I had an interesting conversation. I think I released it a month ago with Space Café Radio with Peter Garretson, also on our space resources and the use of military power to protect that. And that was an interesting structure he provided. And I would like to extend it to, free after Shakespeare, I would say, is it mine or is it not mine? With regards to the resource utilization, how can potential conflicts be mitigated in determining ownership and rights? Is the involvement of entities like Space Force then necessary? Because it's set up for that, and you mentioned the military installations on the moon are prohibited, but it's just a matter of time, isn't it?
So when President Johnson, no relation, was at the signing ceremony of the Outer Space Treaty, he said that he made very strong and clear remarks about peaceful activity on the moon. And that, he's remarks along the lines of that the scourge of war has followed humankind wherever we have gone. We must not prevent the scourge of war to follow us to the moon. And that when cosmonauts meet astronauts on the surface of the moon, they should meet as brothers and not as warriors. So that is why we have those very clear and strong prohibitions in Article 4, Paragraph 2. Not just the moon shall be used for peaceful purposes, the moon shall be used exclusively for peaceful purposes. So that word was put in there intentionally. And then, as I said, there are 3 nouns and 2 verbs which are prohibited on the moon. There are no military bases, installations, or fortifications. There are no military maneuvers or weapons testing that are permitted on the moon. And that's the second sentence. Very clear, strong prohibitions of military activity on the moon. There are certain carve-outs that if military personnel are taking part in scientific endeavors, they would be allowed on the moon. And that is why, we shouldn't have a problem with, say, U.S. military serving as astronauts. And we saw the announcement a couple of days ago of Artemis 2 mission crew. And some of them, I think 2 or 3 of them have military backgrounds. That's perfectly permissible. But in terms of military maneuvers on the moon, military enforcement maneuvers, this is contrary to the spirit and the letter of the Outer Space Treaty. And I believe that if we are to strongly adhere to all the other encouragements that we see in the Outer Space Treaty, which I've mentioned numerous times about due regard, basis of reciprocity, visitation rights, treatment of astronauts as envoys of mankind, we should not have to have any military enforcement of what we want to do on the moon. And that is a path that we don't want to go down in terms of what future of humanity. The response to that people will say, well, everywhere humans have gone, military is followed and conflict is followed. This is not true. we can point to numerous domains where people get along peacefully without military enforcements or conflict. Antarctica is one of them, and that's a great one because it's also an area outside of state territory where only we have state jurisdiction. States retain jurisdiction over their launched space objects and personnel thereof, but there will be no territory on the moon, and there is no rationale that I can think of for national militaries and space militaries to be on the surface of the moon. There's other methods of enforcement and establishing coordination and preserving peaceful uses.
I think it's very brave to mention the Antarctica as a good example. In a time and that's on a day where Russia is conducting a huge maneuver in the Arctic. Héloïse, any thoughts from your end on that?
I think it's a great question, and I surely hope that military activities do not, or at least conflicts that we see on Earth, do not follow on the moon. And I think that's why working groups or groups like the Moon Dialogues are so important today, because we try to be as diverse as possible and get as many viewpoints as possible, because we tend to simplify those conflicts by saying, oh, everyone's on one side, everyone's on the other side. But there are a lot of individuals in the meantime, from each side that want to have and want to create those dialogues and those discussions. And so I think having those groups and those examples of international cooperation, even on a small scale, provides a great example of how we can eventually and hopefully translate it on a bigger scale and eventually on the moon.
I have to amend that and add that resources to be spent on space and space development are finite. And the rationale that underpins international law and non-militarization is that your security condition is improved if you don't have to, if you take certain activities off the table and you prohibit certain activities, your security conditions are improved because you're not going to do it and the other actor also promises not to do it. And therefore, rather than spending money on militaries, you can spend money on civil activities. So, rather than spending time and resources and human capital on hardening your activities and using bulletproof tanks, you can drive around in cars that don't need to be shielded from weapons, and you can spend your capital and your resources on scientific endeavors and commercial endeavors rather than offensive and defensive capabilities. That's the wager of military, of non-armament and security arrangements, is that we'll save money. We can, guns and butter, like we can spend more money on peaceful activities and not have to worry about military activities. And that's another reason to, seek to preserve peace on the moon. It's in everyone's best interests.
I hear your words. And I see our day-by-day reality, especially here in Europe, and that speaks another language, and that's the reality we are faced with. So I see the rationale of the policy handbook, and I really admire this way forward. But I think we are on the edge that our life on Earth can flip from more or less one day to the next one. Héloïse, back to the Lunar Policy Handbook. How do you see the handbook adapting and evolving now over time as the lunar ecosystem continues to grow and new challenges will emerge? So, I mean, so far you have we should take the time to celebrate it, but now we're looking what comes next.
Absolutely, and I tend personally to always look what's coming after. So I really appreciate that question. I think the Lunar Policy Handbook is meant to be a document that's a living document, meaning that it is meant to evolve over time and to adapt and to update itself as well. whether with different authors or in a different shape or form or anything, but it's not meant to be a sitting document that's the whole and single truth, or, you know, single point of contact for, or like point of reference rather, for the lunar activity questions and policy implications of those. I think the real aspect that is very interesting to me about the Lunar Policy Handbook is that we covered a small part of the lunar activities that will take place on the moon. And we covered also a small part of the policy implications that those activities will raise. And although it is a very precise, we did it in a very precise and, you know, thoroughly researched way, there's still, like we said, thousands of questions that arise even by just talking to each other right now. For instance, we've raised more questions than we've answered throughout this conversation. So I think what's going to be very interesting for the Lunar Policy Handbook in the near future is to see what types of recommendations or what types of policy questions were raised and were correctly or rightfully raised as we see those activities actually taking place on the moon. And then it's also going to be even more interesting to see how the Lunar Policy Handbook or its further edition will update itself, and which questions did we raise that we didn't answer properly, or which question we didn't raise, for instance, that we should have raised, but we were not aware right now. Because it's very difficult to think about those questions right now, because like I've mentioned and like we've talked about throughout this conversation, we're talking about future activities, right? It's not taking place as we speak right now on the moon. It's not there yet. It's probably going to be in 10, 15, 20 years from now for, you know, like the actual infrastructures to be on the moon. So that's what's going to be very interesting. Also, having feedback from experts and having different points of views on those questions will also be extremely interesting for the Lunar Policy Handbook to receive even today and take care and take note of them for a future edition. I think when we were talking about it at the beginning of the Lunar Policy Handbook, and Chris corrects me if I don't remember the dates right, but I think we were mentioning to have an edition, an updated edition every 2 to 3 years, because it's a reasonable time frame for activities to develop, evolve, to eventually also not happen or happen in a different manner than what we were thinking about. So I think that's the future of the Lunar Policy Handbook, and I'm very excited to see either that group working on a different or a newer edition, or even other groups working on something similar that could be complementary, of the Lunar Policy Handbook.
That's interesting that you see it 10, 15 years from now just kicking in. So
I'm talking about settled activities, right? Like not just going there and
Chris, anything?
Yeah, I mean, so briefly, we did a launch event at the United Nations Committee on Peaceful Uses legal subcommittee. We handed out copies to delegations, a variety of member states. You know, I brought back 8 copies that I have for me to distribute as I can here in Washington, D.C. You know, and really it's putting this in the hands of decision makers and seeing where we go from here. That was a question from someone in the chat about, you know, how do we plan to operationalize this? I'll also mention, and Harshita can maybe drop the link to it, but you know, we have it for free online as a PDF. We've also created this drop shipping option so that if you are somewhere else in the world, then, you know, finding me in person, you can order a copy. We're all not for profits, so we're not making profit out of this, but if you want to have, you know, copies for your classroom or copies to hand to somebody at your capital, we want to do that in a way that, you know, you can get a physical copy and hand to someone. And yeah, I think that we're going to have to continue on these discussions as we see lunar norms develop and as we see lunar ambitions develop. And you know, I'll briefly mention that over at Open Lunar, there's this idea of a lunar policy platform, which Antonino Salmeri from SGAC, but also now from Open Lunar, is trying to stand up to act as a convening forum for people who are doing lunar activities to share what they're going to do and to see if there are issues that need to be discussed and possibly, you know, work towards consensus on some of these issues. As you know, Secure World is not a lunar actor. We're not going to be launching things to the moon, but we can be a trusted convener of stakeholders. And you know, stakeholders are not just people who are going to the moon. There are people who care about the moon. There's civil society, there's scientists, they're the public back here on Earth. You have just as much a right to what happens on the moon and having your say there as the people who are spending resources to go there.
Just on that note, Antonino will be guest in our Stephen Freeland's upcoming Space Café Law Breakfast, I think on the 25th-ish, but it's conflicting with Glock, so we will see of May. We will see how that will turn out together with Rovimbo. So we make place for the next generation now. So
excellent.
That's good. So what are the upcoming plans now for Moon Dialogue, for the partners that after the release of the handbook? So what's next? Héloïse, Chris.
Well, I think that's a question for Chris, rather.
Oh,
well, as I said, we're going to be looking towards, you put a lot of work in writing a book, and then it is published. You got to put in just as much work promoting it, getting it out there. We have, we paid for 100 copies to be printed, but we're looking for potential other stakeholders who could, print the next edition of copies. We're also, considering doing side events and further events and engagements in various countries. That would be interesting to we want to bring our findings and our scholarship to other fora that are talking about lunar governance and lunar policy. So nothing to announce yet, but we definitely, the Moon Dialogues continues from Secure World. I found the other dialogues conveners to be excellent partners in this, because we all care about it, and I think that if you want to encourage sustainability, cooperation, interoperability, transparency, if you want to encourage those things on the moon, you have to model that behavior and display it yourself. So we're definitely trying to model all of those values as we go forward in discussing lunar norms.
Great. Héloïse, something to add from your end, or are we fine? I mean, we are totally over time, so it's almost 9 o'clock here.
That as well.
Good. I want to make it.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say very briefly that it's been an absolute privilege and a very humbling experience as well to work as the project lead of the Lunar Policy Handbook, and I'm very happy to see it out in the world. Like I said, it wouldn't have been possible to make it happen without such a strong and respectful team behind the scenes. We're only 2 people representing this whole team, and it's great to acknowledge those participants as well. And for the future of the Lunar Policy Handbook, I'm very curious to see how people will interact with it, what the thoughts about it will be, and how it can be also a very useful tool. Chris mentioned it, but civil society has a say in what lunar activities will look like. And I think that handbook is also very important because it's written in a way that is obviously expert level, or like regarding the preciseness of the information that's in there, but it's written in a very accessible manner. So it's not overwhelming for someone who doesn't know about policies or lunar activities. If you are curious about those questions and if you want to learn more, this handbook is a perfect way to start and to feed your curiosity, and then eventually moving on to more heavy or like more precise documents or articles or books, etc. So don't be shy, even if you don't have experience in the space realm. This handbook is perfectly accessible for anyone, and that's what we intended to do.
I can just second it. Or I read it the last days, and I have to say it's easy to digest even for someone who is not or native English speaking. And with my basic English, I could grasp what is in. So thanks for making that effort to keep the language simple. So I'm very sorry to our audience, but we can't take any of your questions. So just a shout out to Juan. Yeah, thank you very much for mentioning. We said before, it's the three of us are ISU alumni, and it's great to have the former president of the ISU in the house here. Shout out to Ian Grossner, to Laura Zielinski and her activities, Mark Meyer, Renee Laufer, and not last but not least, Christophe Bosquillon. And I know I mispronounced it, but he and his work at the Moon Village Association, I think is it still called, is also pointing into the same directions. And I'm think that it's a typical example of 1 + 1 is more than just 2. Great. With that, I would like to thank you for your time and make these 33 minutes so engaging and exciting. And I think my excuse is I invite 2 people and then make 66 minutes out of that. So that's simple math. With that, Elena, are you still with us, or did you fall asleep already?
How could I?
Excite you?
Of course, I'm still here. I mean, it was great. And thank you both for your insights. Before we say goodbye, let me remind you of the upcoming events. Tomorrow, the 12th of April at 4 p.m. in Central Europe, we're going to launch a new regional chapter. So be ready for that. It's going to be Space Café Poland by Lukas Wilczynski. And next week, from the 17th to the 20th of April, Emma and Torsten will be at Space Symposium in Colorado Springs. And
just for Poland, we will do it in English. So for all of you that are not speaking Polish, we will do it in English here.
Yeah, thank you, Torsten, for that. And so tune in next week for the best coverage you can find of this exciting conference. And on the 25th of April, 4 p.m., always Central European time, join our Space Café 33 Minutes with Clemens Kaiser. On the 27th of April at 4 p.m. again, we're launching a second new regional chapter, Space Café India by Rika Valluri. And her guest is going to be Rajagopalan. And so we're very excited for that too. On the 28th of April, the day after that, don't miss our Space Café Poland by Angela Matisse. And stay tuned because we're going to...
Scotland. This time it's Scotland. So many regions. Poor Elena.
Too many, yeah. But anyway, stay tuned because in May, we're going to announce it very soon, the exact date for Space Café Law Breakfast with Stephen Freeland. And so Torsten already mentioned that. As usual, all our events are going to be online on Eventbrite, and we would love to hear your feedback. So please check in with us on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. And don't forget to sign up for our daily and our bi-weekly newsletters. And if you'd like to treat yourselves with something special, become a Space Watcher today or help us in the supporter program. Thank you again, Héloïse and Chris, for this insightful talk and for being our guests. And thanks again to the entire team behind the scenes for doing this great job week by week again. Thank you, our audience, for joining us. I hope to see you next week in upcoming events. In the meantime, visit our website and follow us on social media. Take care, and don't forget, become a Space Watcher. Thank you, and bye.
Bye-bye.